The Sierra Madre mountain range in Mexico is a place of breathtaking beauty, with its towering peaks, dense forests, and deep valleys. It's a land rich with history and legend, and one of the most chilling tales whispered among the locals is that of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. According to legend, La Llorona was a woman who, in a fit of madness, drowned her children in a river and now roams the earth, wailing in despair and searching for their lost souls. It is said that those who hear her cries are doomed to meet a tragic end. Despite the terrifying legend, a group of friends decided to spend a weekend camping in the heart of the Sierra Madre Mountains. Carlos, Maria, Luis, and Elena were all experienced hikers and campers, and the allure of an adventure in the mountains was too great to resist. They had heard the stories of La Llorona, but like many, they dismissed them as just that, stories. The group set out early one Saturday morning, their backpacks loaded with supplies. The trail they had chosen led deep into the mountains, through dense forests and along the edge of steep cliffs. The air was crisp and cool, and the scent of pine and earth filled their lungs. The beauty of the landscape was overwhelming, and they couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement as they ventured further into the wilderness. By late afternoon, they reached their destination, a small, secluded clearing near a rushing river, surrounded by towering trees. It was the perfect spot to set up camp, with plenty of space for their tents and a fire pit ready for use. As they unpacked their gear, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the forest. "This place is incredible," Carlos said, looking around at the towering trees and the clear, fast-moving river. "We couldn't have picked a better spot." Maria nodded in agreement. "It's perfect. We'll have a great view of the stars tonight." Luis, always the practical one, began gathering firewood. "Let's get a fire going before it gets too dark." "It's going to get cold out here," Alina, who had been quiet for most of the hike, glanced toward the river with a troubled expression. "Does anyone else feel uneasy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others looked at her in surprise. Elena was usually the most enthusiastic about their adventures, always the first to suggest a new hike or camping trip. But now there was a note of anxiety in her voice that they hadn't heard before. "Uneasy? What do you mean?" Maria asked, concerned. Elena hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. It's probably just the stories we've heard, about La Llorona. It's silly, I know, but I can't help feeling like we're being watched." Carlos laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, Elena. You don't really believe in those old legends, do you? It's just a story to scare kids." Luis, however, was more thoughtful. "It's true that the legend of La Llorona is one of the oldest in Mexico. People have been telling it for generations, but like most legends, there's probably a grain of truth in it somewhere." Maria rolled her eyes. "Let's not get carried away with ghost stories. We're here to enjoy ourselves. Now, who's hungry?" As they settled around the campfire, the conversation turned to lighter topics: work, friends, and plans for future trips. The unease that Elena had felt earlier seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the camaraderie of friends. But as night fell and the stars began to appear in the sky, the atmosphere grew more subdued. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the cool night air. The sound of the river rushing over the rocks was a constant, soothing background noise. But then, just as they were beginning to relax, they heard something that made their blood run cold: a faint, distant wail that seemed to rise from the depths of the forest. It was a sound like no other, an eerie, mournful cry that echoed through the trees and sent shivers down their spines. The wail was filled with sorrow and despair, and it seemed to carry on the wind, growing louder and more intense with each passing moment. Elena was the first to react. She stiffened, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others nodded, their faces pale. The wail continued, long and drawn out, before fading into silence. For a moment, no one spoke, each of them struggling to process what they had just heard. "That That sounded like Maria began, but she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. L.A. Llorona, Luis said, his voice barely above a whisper. It sounded like Leia Llorona. Carlos shook his head, trying to convince himself more than the others. It's just the wind. We're in the mountains. Sounds can do strange things out here. But even as he spoke, the wail returned, louder and more desperate than before. It was unmistakable now, the sound of a woman crying, filled with unbearable grief. The legend of La Llorona suddenly felt all too real, and the sense of unease that Elena had felt earlier returned in full force. "We need to leave," Elena said urgently, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be here." Maria, who had been skeptical at first, was now visibly frightened. "But where can we go?" "It's too dark to hike back, and the forest is too thick to navigate at night." Luis stood up, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "We need to stay together. We'll keep the fire going all night, and in the morning we'll pack up and leave." The group huddled closer together, their eyes darting nervously into the surrounding forest. The wail continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, an ominous presence that refused to be ignored. The once peaceful forest now seemed sinister, the shadows between the trees hiding something malevolent. As the night wore on, the wail of La Llorona grew louder, filling the air with its sorrowful cry. The friends sat in silence, too afraid to speak, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent them into a panic, fearing that the ghostly figure of La Llorona would appear before them. At one point, Carlos thought he saw a figure moving among the trees, a pale shape that seemed to glide silently through the forest. He blinked, and it was gone, but the image was burned into his mind. He didn't dare mention it to the others, not wanting to add to their fear. Hours passed, but sleep was impossible. They could only sit and wait, praying for the first light of dawn to break the darkness and chase away the terror that surrounded them. But as the night dragged on, the wail of La Llorona began to change. It became more frantic, more desperate, and seemed to be getting closer. Finally, just before dawn, the wail reached a fever pitch. It was as if La Llorona was standing right beside them, her cry so loud and piercing that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The fire flickered and sputtered, as if struggling against an unseen force. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wail stopped. The forest was plunged into an eerie silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The friends looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn, each wondering if the nightmare was finally over. But then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. She was tall and slender, her long black hair flowing around her like a veil. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, empty voids. She wore a tattered white dress stained with dirt and water, and her feet were bare, leaving no trace on the ground. The woman floated toward them, her movements slow and deliberate. There was no mistaking who she was. La Llorona, the weeping woman, had found them. Maria let out a strangled cry, backing away in terror. Luis stood frozen, unable to move, while Carlos reached for a stick from the fire as if it could offer some protection against the spirit. But Elena, who had felt the presence of La Llorona from the moment they arrived, seemed almost calm. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the ghostly figure, and spoke in a trembling voice. "Please, we didn't mean to disturb you. We're sorry." La Llorona stopped, her hollow eyes fixed on Elena. For a moment, the air was thick with tension, and then to their astonishment, the spirit began to speak. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight of sorrow that was almost unbearable. "They took my children," she said, her voice breaking with grief. "They took them from me, and now I am cursed to wander these lands searching for them." Elena felt a surge of sympathy for the spirit. Despite the fear, she could feel the deep pain that La Llorona carried with her, the pain of a mother who had lost her children. "We're not here to harm you," Elena said gently. "We'll leave this place, and will tell others to stay away, you don't have to suffer anymore. For a moment, Ella Llorona's expression softened, and the wail that had haunted them all night seemed to fade into a sigh. She looked at Elena with something almost like gratitude, and then without another word, she turned and disappeared into the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. The friends stood there, shaken and exhausted, hardly able to believe what had just happened. The first light of dawn began to break through the trees, and with it came a sense of relief. The nightmare was over. They quickly packed up their camp and began the hike back to civilization, eager to leave the Sierra Madre behind. But as they walked, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Ella Llorona was still with them, somewhere in the shadows. When they finally reached the safety of their car, they didn't speak of what they had seen. The legend of Ella Llorona was no longer just a story to them, it was a reality they had lived through, a haunting experience that would stay with them forever. As they drove away from the mountains, Elena looked back at the dark silhouette of the Sierra Madre, now bathed in the light of the rising sun. She could still hear the faint echo of La Llorona's cry in her mind, a reminder that some legends are more than just stories, they are a warning. And so the tale of La Llorona continued to be told, a chilling reminder to all who ventured into the Sierra Madre that the weeping woman still roams the land, searching for her lost children, and that those who hear her cry are never the same again. The Island of the Dolls, or Isla de las Muñecas, is a place steeped in mystery and dread. Located deep within the canals of Xochimilco, just south of Mexico City, the island is infamous for its bizarre and eerie appearance. Dolls of all shapes and sizes hang from the trees, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the dense vegetation. Local legend has it that the island is haunted by the spirit of a young girl who drowned in the canals, and the dolls were hung by the island's caretaker to appease her restless ghost. Despite the ominous reputation of Isla de las Muñecas, a group of friends decided to embark on a camping trip to the island, driven by a mix of curiosity and the thrill of exploring one of Mexico's most haunted locations. The group consisted of Diego, Isabel, Valeria, and Javier, all adventurous souls who had heard the stories but were determined to see the island for themselves. They set out early on a Saturday morning, boarding a colorful trajinera, one of the traditional flat-bottomed boats used to navigate the canals of Xochimilco. The journey was long and winding, the dense vegetation closing in around them as they ventured deeper into the maze-like waterways. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the steady rhythm of the boatman's pole dipping into the water and the occasional call of distant birds. As they approached the island, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. The once vibrant chatter among them faded into silence as the island came into view. The trees were draped with countless dolls, their limbs dangling lifelessly, their faces cracked and weathered by time. Some were missing eyes, others had their heads hanging at unnatural angles, and all of them seemed to be watching as the boat drew closer. "This place is even creepier than I imagined," Valeria whispered, her voice barely audible over the lapping of the water. Diego, always the skeptic, shrugged off her comment. "It's just an island with a bunch of old dolls. There's nothing to be scared of." Isabel, who had been staring intently at the island, frowned. "It feels wrong. Like we shouldn't be here." Javier, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, guys, we're here to have an adventure. Let's set up camp and enjoy the night. We'll have stories to tell for years." The boatman, a stoic old man who had remained silent during the journey, guided the boat to the edge of the island. As they disembarked, he gave them a warning in a low, gravelly voice. "Respect the spirits of this place. Do not anger them or you will regret it." The friends exchanged uneasy glances, but Diego brushed off the warning with a laugh. "We'll be fine. We're just here to camp." "Nothing more," the boatman said, "nothing more. Simply pushing off from the shore and disappearing into the mist that clung to the canals." The group was now alone on the island, the silence pressing in around them like a heavy shroud. They quickly set about setting up their camp in a small clearing near the water's edge. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the island. The trees, with their eerie decorations, seemed to close in on them, the dolls swaying gently in the breeze, as if alive. As night fell, they gathered around a small campfire, the flames casting flickering light on the surrounding trees. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the dolls hanging above them and the distant croak of frogs in the canals. Diego, trying to shake off the unease, suggested they tell ghost stories. What better place to share some scary tales than on a haunted island? Javier grinned, but there was a nervous edge to it. All right, but let's keep it light. No need to scare ourselves too much. Valeria glanced around the darkening forest, her unease growing with each passing minute. Maybe we should just call it a night. This place. It's different from other places we've camped. I don't like it. Before anyone could respond, a faint sound reached their ears, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But there was no wind. The trees stood still, the night air calm and unmoving. Isabel stiffened, her eyes wide. Did you hear that? The others nodded, their faces pale. The whispering grew louder, seeming to come from all around them, yet from nowhere in particular. It was an eerie, disembodied sound that set their nerves on edge. Diego stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It's probably just the wind through the trees, he said, though even he didn't believe his own words. But the whispering continued, growing in intensity. It was as if the island itself was alive. The very trees and the dolls within them conspiring to unnerve the intruders. And then, without warning, one of the dolls hanging from a nearby tree began to move. Its head, which had been hanging limply to one side, slowly lifted, its glassy eyes fixing on the group. Valeria let out a strangled scream, scrambling back from the tree. Did you see that? It moved Diego, his bravado quickly fading, shook his head. No, it's impossible. It must be a trick of the light. But even as he spoke, more dolls began to move. Their heads turned slowly, their eyes following the group's every movement. The whispering grew louder, the sound filling the air around them, becoming almost deafening. Isabel grabbed Diego's arm, her voice trembling. We need to leave. Now. But as they turned to gather their things, they realized with growing horror that the dolls weren't just moving, they were changing. Their faces, once lifeless and cracked, were now twisted into expressions of anger and malice. The once soft whispering had become a cacophony of voices, all chanting in a language they couldn't understand. Javier, his heart pounding in his chest, tried to keep calm. We need to get to the boat. We can't stay here. But when they looked toward the shore, they saw with dread that the boat was gone, the old boatman having taken it with him when he left. They were stranded on the island, surrounded by a growing army of malevolent dolls. The group huddled together, their eyes darting around the clearing as the dolls seemed to close in on them. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the fire sputtered as if struggling to stay alive. Valeria, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "We shouldn't have come here. We've disturbed something evil." The whispering voices reached a crescendo, and suddenly the fire went out, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the pale moon above, casting eerie shadows across the dolls that now seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Diego, his bravado completely gone, clutched Isabel's hand. "We need to stay together. Whatever happens, we can't get separated." But as he spoke, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the island seemed to shift, the very earth twisting and turning as if alive. The trees swayed violently, and the dolls began to fall from their branches, landing with sickening thuds around the group. One by one, the fallen dolls began to rise, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as if controlled by invisible strings. They stood on their tiny legs, their faces twisted in grotesque mockeries of human expressions, and began to shuffle toward the group. Isabel screamed, backing away as the dolls closed in. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But it was real. The dolls moved with purpose, their once lifeless eyes now burning with a malevolent light. They reached out with tiny hands, their fingers claw-like and grasping. The group broke into a run, fleeing into the dense forest, the dolls pursuing them with unnatural speed. The once familiar paths were now a maze of darkness, the trees closing in around them, blocking their way. Diego led the way, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out. But no matter which direction they turned, the dolls were always there, waiting for them, their eyes glowing in the dark. Finally, they reached a small clearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The dolls had stopped their pursuit, but the whispering continued, surrounding them, filling their minds with fear. Xavier, his voice shaking, said, "We need to figure out what they want. Why are they doing this?" Isabel, clutching her head as if in pain, whispered, "They're angry. They were brought here to appease the spirit, but something went wrong. They became vessels for something dark, something that now wants to consume us." Valeria, her face pale and drawn, nodded. "We have to make it right. We have to offer something to them, something that will calm the spirits." Diego, desperation in his eyes, pulled out his pocket knife. "What do we have that they would want? We can't just sit here and wait for them to take us." Isabel thought for a moment, her mind racing. Then, with a sudden realization, she said, "The boatman, he told us to respect the spirits. Maybe we need to make an offering to them. Something valuable, something that shows we mean no harm." They quickly searched through their belongings, but found nothing that seemed fitting. In a moment of desperation, Isabel took off her grandmother's necklace, a family heirloom that she had always treasured. The pendant was a small silver cross worn smooth with age. "This," she said, her voice trembling, "it's the most precious thing I have. If we offer it to them, maybe they'll let us go." The others hesitated, but there was no other option. They placed the necklace on the ground in the center of the clearing and stepped back, holding their breath. For a moment, nothing happened. The whispering continued, and the air grew colder, but the dolls remained still. Then, slowly, the ground beneath the necklace began to pulse with a faint light, and the whispering voices seemed to soften, as if considering the offering. The light grew brighter, enveloping the necklace, and then with a sudden burst, it vanished, taking the necklace with it. The whispering stopped, and a deep silence fell over the island. The dolls, once animated with dark energy, collapsed to the ground, lifeless once more. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the trees seemed to part, revealing a clear path to the shore. The group stood there, shaken and exhausted, hardly able to believe what had just happened. They didn't speak, didn't dare to break the fragile peace that had settled over the island. As they made their way back to the shore, they found the boat waiting for them, as if it had never left. The boatman was there, his expression unreadable as they boarded the Trajanera. Without a word, he pushed off from the shore and guided them back through the canals, the island of the dolls receding into the mist behind them. None of them looked back, afraid of what they might see. The journey back to the city was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts, the events of the night replaying in their minds. When they finally reached the docks, the boatman spoke only one word as they disembarked, "Remember." They nodded, unable to find their voices, and made their way back to the city. The haunting memories of Isla de las Muñecas would stay with them forever, a chilling reminder of the dark forces that still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next unwary soul to disturb their rest. And as they walked away from the canals of Xochimilco, the dolls on the island remained, their glassy eyes watching, waiting for the next visitors who would dare to challenge the spirits of Isla de las Muñecas. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.